In this week's episode, I had the opportunity to meet with Kevin Silva, the former Executive Vice President and Chief Human Resources Officer at Voya Financial. Kevin was born and raised on Long Island. His father was a 20-year Marine and Navy medic. Kevin has two siblings. His sister, who has been a News 12 anchorwoman on Long Island for 30 years, and his brother, who has been the chairman of SHRM and is also a CHRO. Kevin attended Nassau Community College before going on to St. John's University. He then attended NYU while working for Pepsi to obtain his graduate degree in personnel psychology. Later, he received an honorary doctorate degree from NYIT, where he served as chairman of the board of trustees. Kevin started his career at Pepsi, where he was the executive director of human resources for the PepsiCo Management Institute. Following his time at Pepsi, he served as the vice president of global human resources and development at MasterCard. Next, Kevin spent time at Merrill Lynch as the vice president, director of human resources. Later, Kevin completed his career as the executive vice president and CHRO at Voya Financial. Currently, Kevin is enjoying retirement, but continues to be an entrepreneur. He has done coaching with C-suite executives and has played a role in launching several talent companies and serves on the board of FSU Marine. He is married to his spouse, Julianne, and has 4 children. Some of Kevin's hobbies and interests outside of work include world travel, racing high-performance cars, and playing the guitar. One of the ways you can support this channel is to subscribe, like, and comment on the video. This tremendously helps with the YouTube algorithms to get the Tales from the C-Suite podcast broader exposure to leaders from all walks of life. I would greatly appreciate your help in supporting the growth of our channel. If you find our interviews insightful and helpful with your career, please encourage your friends and colleagues to also listen to our episodes and subscribe, like, and comment on the videos. Thank you for your support and welcome to the show. Welcome, friends, to another episode of the Tales from the C-Suite podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Adam Bandelli, and I'm very excited to be joined today by the former Chief Human Resource Officer of Voya Financial, Kevin Silva. Kevin, how are you?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I was looking forward to this conversation today. We've known each other now probably for about 10 years, but I've never really dived into your background and some of the events that shaped you. I wanted to start, before we get into all the great things you've done in your career, if you were to think back to childhood and you had to give a chapter heading or a book chapter about that first couple of years of your life, what would that be and why? What would that focus on?
Well, I had a wonderful childhood. I grew up very simply in a modest town called Hicksville. My father was a veteran, medic, Latino. My mother stayed home to raise her 3 children. She was a 3rd generation Irish immigrant in this country. Would have referred to my parents a little bit like Ricky and Lucy on I Love Lucy, if you will. And it conjure up an image. Very simple home, 2 bedrooms, 8 by 10, and we had a suburban life. My father was a great optimist in life. He would always say, who lives better than us? And we didn't know any better. So our view of the world was, this is pretty good, even in a very simple upbringing, if you will. Public school as a young kid, later parochial school, played sports, played music, and had quite an enjoyable time. Played Little League. There's a story behind that later as well.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Sports was a big part of my background and upbringing. I want to spend a little time on your parents. There's often a lot that our mothers and fathers instill in us, values and beliefs. What did you learn from your parents that carried over into your career?
Geez, well, quite a bit. They were both different, but very supportive, had a good relationship. My father was first generation born in this country, Latino immigrant. His native tongue was Spanish, didn't speak English as a kid. He was brought up by a single mother until he was 3, and then she passed away. So he was an orphan at 3 years old.
Okay.
And rightfully could have taken a wrong path in life, but took a great path. Joined the military when he was 17 and was trained in medicine. And he lived for 3 years in China. He lived for 2 years in the Samoan Islands. He learned to speak Mandarin and live there. He learned to live amongst the natives in the South Pacific. He traveled, all of his time was with the military, but he instilled in me a great appreciation for the diversity of the world, for the differences in culture, but also the sameness in people. Probably my interest in people came greatly from him. My mother, on the other side, came from some means. One of my grandfathers on that side was the first Supreme Court Justice in New York. They were very involved with the politics in New York and a very prosperous family. but lost all their wealth, Wall Street. And so she taught me a little bit about frugality and planning, and sometimes difficult things can happen. So we had the two of those influences, me, my brother, and my sister in life.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think having that background, I spent a couple of years over abroad when I was an undergrad, and then I've done a lot of international work as well. The understanding of culture and upbringing. When you look at your time at Voya or some of the other jobs that you've had over your career, how does that foundation of culture and understanding people's differences and embracing those things, how did that show up in your work?
My father was the greatest mentor I could have, and he taught me lessons in installments, taught me lessons when I didn't realize I was having lessons. A little bit taught me about bringing out the full potential of others and appreciating people and supporting them in that way. So, but Voya had a great interest in people, had a great interest in developing them, had a great interest in unlocking their full potential. I mean, over my career, I've probably created at least half a dozen CHROs that are very successful and mentored quite a number of people. So that became very natural to me based on my upbringing and experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So you said you have a couple siblings. What was the birth order? Were you the oldest, middle, youngest?
I was the oldest. Then I have a sister. Then I have a brother. We were brought up to think anything is possible and everything is possible,
Hmm.
and didn't understand growing up any different views than that. So we reached and we achieved and we grew because that's a little bit of the orientation that we had. My sister eventually ended up becoming a anchor newswoman in New York for 3 decades. My brother ended up in the HR field. He was actually chairman of SHRM, Society
Okay.
of Human Resource Management, for
Yeah.
a number of years, and also had chief HR positions in global companies. So we had good experiences and we had good support at an early age to grow and aspire to our full potential.
I'm the oldest of four, so I can appreciate being the first of the siblings. What was that like for you? Was there a shoulder of responsibility, role model that you had to lead for your younger siblings?
You can't choose your birth order, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed being the first. I guess there are lessons you learn. Your parents are trying out techniques. They're fearful and they probably manage you closer. I certainly was managed closer than my younger brother. I used to think that he got away with a lot more than
When you look beyond your family, Kevin, were there role models, people that sewed into your life? You mentioned baseball and sports, music. Were there people, teachers, folks that kind of invested in you at an early age?
I think my most significant role models came into the workforce. I will tell you the role model baseball story. I was not a good athlete, and I did play Little League. When I was playing Little League, it's actually when I learned that I needed to wear glasses. I was a pitcher, and I would hit the batter 50% of the ball with my pitches, and eyeglasses became the solution to that. But at that time, they would do a draft of kids into a Little League, and I was in the last draft and effectively not picked. And so they said to me, if any of your fathers are dumb enough to pick up this team, go home and tell them and see what you can do. I went home, told my father the story. I said, look, we need a coach. We need somebody to lead the team. And my father said, I'll do it. I said, Dad, what do you know about baseball? He said, very little. I know how the sports play, but I know a lot about people. So he came and he coached the team. The kid team was a little bit of the bad news bears, the leftovers. And he brought us from the leftovers all the way through the pennant championships just through good coaching. Great lesson in my life. How ordinary people can do extraordinary things with the right coaching and mentoring.
Yeah, I've seen that in my own life as well. Some of the coaches I had, middle school, high school, just the ability to bring people together. A lot of the work that I do today, Kevin, as a leadership advisor, the origin and the roots were from sports. What it means to be a leader, what it means to role model, what it means to inspire others. What lessons did you learn from sports that you carried on through your career?
I think sports is a wonderful, wonderful platform. I've incorporated that as two fundamental questions or screens when I interview. I ask people, tell me about your mentors in life. Who were the people that were interested in you? Who invested in you? What did you learn from those investments? I think mentoring and asking about that's quite important. And I ask about sports. The people I hired used to kid me because I'd go back to high school and say, let's talk about your experiences there in sports. But if you look at sports, Adam, that's where people learn discipline. They learn teamwork. They learn sharing. They learn working towards a common goal. They learn playing their position. So there are many lessons that sports can teach. So I think that can provide a very valuable platform. And I've interviewed for that and it's worked well. You know, another story, I did at one time interview somebody for an HR position. And this person said, I never had a mentor.
Mm.
I learned everything by myself. I chose not to hire that person because teaching them to work with others in the workforce after the fact was just going to be a bridge too far. And although this person had done many of these things on their own, it's almost as if someone said, I had to touch every hot stove on my own to find out if it was hot. I couldn't listen to others. I couldn't learn from others. And
Yeah.
so that coaching and mentoring is critically important.
You're hitting on a really important area, I think, Kevin, that I see a lot with senior executives. Their balance between humility and ego. I've worked with a number of leaders who can be a little arrogant, a little cocky. I'm actually working on my third book. It's called Dealing with Jackasses, How to Use Relational Intelligence to Navigate Difficult Relationships. And so I think you give a great example of someone who is more of an I versus a we. How have you navigated difficult personalities in the C-suites with boards? I got to see some of this firsthand with Rod and some of the other senior leaders at Voya. But where did you develop these skills? Did it come naturally to you?
Some things are natural, but so much is learned, Adam. And you hit on a great point of ego. Well, the Eastern religions talk about one's greatest challenge is to manage one's own ego.
That's right.
Manage that first, and you can have mastery over other situations. I've got a view in the world that sometimes money, power, and authority are actually corrupting. And I've said that there are a few people that can survive money, power, and authority uncorrupted. Be careful about praying for those things. So knowing how to use those and knowing how to maintain one's value and leadership when you're in those positions is critically important. Also, you bring up another good point, which is dealing with difficult people. Adam, I've always been fascinated by your research. I think your work is so important and so relevant, but so is the work of Ben Franklin, and so is the work of some of the early leaders of this country and other historical people, Marcus Aurelius. If you go back and you look at time, almost everything we need to know has been known by someone at some time. And so dealing with difficult people is a key to success, or it can be a derailer. Now, difficult people can be also described as different.
Yeah. I guess it depends on the context and the circumstances.
It depends on the reader and what you're seeing. Sometimes people define difficult as, well, that person's different than me. They think differently than me. Does that make them difficult, or does that make them different? And are they different because of their culture and experiences? And is different bad? So, it's a question to ponder, but it's a skill that one really needs in the workforce, is how to deal with people who are different.
I found with a lot of the leaders that I've worked with going SVP to EVP or VP to SVP, the ability to trust your gut. I like to call it your spidey sense. Is that something that came natural for you? How did you hone and refine that?
Let's call it spidey sense. Let's call it gut. Let's call it interpersonal skills. I think there's levels of maturity and evolution in an executive. At the bottom level of an organization, one has technical skills. Then as you move up, you have managerial skills, or let's even call them leadership skills. And there's two kinds of leadership skills. There's leadership by authority, because people report to you, or there's leadership by influence. And certainly the more valuable one is leadership by influence, when you can manage people outside of your group. The next is interpersonal skills, the ability to get along with others, to listen, to react to others. That's a category of skills where so many executives derail because they don't know how to get along with others. And I think at the highest level of an organization, Adam, is what I call wisdom, judgment, and character. Let's say you've got the technical skills, you've got the leadership skills, you've even got interpersonal skills. But wisdom, judgment, and character are what boards look for. And I'll give you an example. When you read the Wall Street Journal or the Times or the Washington Post and you see a story of a failed executive, it's probably one of those categories that they failed on: wisdom, judgment, or character. And they got lost in their position. They got lost in their ego or their power. And so keeping those things in mind and evolving through this thing in a way where it's not just about you, it's about engaging others, is a journey. It's a process, some natural and some learned.
Makes great sense. Going back to childhood, if I was to pull you aside in elementary school and say, what do you want to be when you grow up? What are your thoughts early on in terms of what you wanted to do?
I wanted to be in a rock and roll band. Where we start and where we end are very different places, but I learned great lessons there. I played music professionally for 8 years and toured and recorded and played in big venues. You look at where the ball drops New Year's Eve in Times Square, and there used to be a club there. And I played with my band when we were 17 years old. And I thought, this life is great. And I love music. But I looked around at my other 5 bandmates who were childhood friends. And I asked the question, is this the team I want to bet my life on? looked at their values and behaviors and work ethics, and came to the conclusion that as much as I love music, it's a little precarious to stake my future on these other 5 people. So I learned there's a difference there between friends and even a productive team that you would go through in life. And one of the lessons was learning picking teammates for whatever endeavor you're in is critically important. Learned it early, learned it well, and that was a great experience.
When you think about folks who will be in the C-suite next 7 to 10 years, oftentimes you're put into a senior level role and you inherit a team versus getting to build your own team. What advice do you have for folks who have to do a little bit of both? You're given a deck of cards you have to deal with. You got to make some changes, got to bring some folks on. But like you said, the people you surround yourself with won't make or break you.
I think there's a lot of critical decisions that you need to make at the top of an organization. And one of them is your team. Whether you're a CEO or a CHRO or a CAO, selecting your team is one of the most difficult, challenging, and important things you can do. I think there's a litmus test here that I like to ask executives. I say, knowing everything you know, take your team, put them visually in front of you, look at them one at a time, Joe and Jane, et cetera. Knowing everything you know about this executive, would you hire them as your first choice for this role at this compensation in this organization? And there's a binary answer here, yes or no. And I find that executives will not answer the question directly. They'll ponder and they'll say, well, let me tell you about Joe. And Joe's got these faults, but he's better and he's learned these things, but that's not the answer. And this is where executives struggle. The question is not, does Joe have merit or is Joe without merit? Of course, Joe has merit. And that's how Joe got to that position. And of course, Jane has merit. Question is, in this organization, for the task and the strategy and the purpose that you have, is Joe your first choice for this role? And if not, then there's another series of questions that we go through. Do we retrain Joe? Do we reincent Joe? Do we repot Joe in another part of the organization, or do we replace Joe? Again, many times executives will go too quickly to the replace, and that may not be the answer. It may be one of the other things. Replacement is hard, it's difficult, it's pushing the reset button. You've got to give the new executive 6 to 9 months to get up to speed. But there is a process, and one needs to go through that as a CHRO, and one needs to help the CEO think through that process.
That was one thing that I really admired about you, Kevin, as we built a relationship. I used to joke with some colleagues, you were like the consigliere to Rod in terms of being able to be in the room and know the insights of board dynamics and other things. How did you develop that relationship with him? What was the process for you to get that trust with Rod?
Well, thank you, Adam. I've been the consigliere to 6 CEOs of publicly traded companies. If you start with the CEO position, you've got to realize that's the loneliest position around. There is no more difficult position. Advice and support is critically important, and the CHRO, CAO can play a vital role. One of the things that I had to sort out early in my career was the answer to the question, how do I add value? I come to work every day. I get paid a handsome salary. How do I add value? And I would say that right in front of my CEO. And beyond saying that, I actually put together something at one point called the CHRO contract. I sat down with my CEO and said, here's the way I believe I add value. Do you believe this? Here's the space I want to fill. Here's what I would hope you would judge me on. And we came to that agreement. An executive needs to think about in adding value. Am I going to go to the top end of where the CEO needs me, or am I going to go to the lower end? And let me explain. Many of us as CHROs get into these roles because we were head of comp and benefits. We were head of talent management. We were head of culture. We came up one of these HR streams. Maybe we over time had 2 or 3 of them. So when you get into that CHRO role, there's a tendency to play to your strengths. So let me go back down and manage the comp and benefits. Let me go back down and manage the recruiting. Let me administratively manage that which I know well, that which is my skill, that which I can do, because that's where I add value. And I think that's a mistake. I think one needs to hire the people who do know how to manage that to free you up to do the top end. Then the real question is, how do I help the CEO build his or her team? How do I help the CEO with their board relationship? How do I help staff the board? How do I help the CEO with client relationships that they need? How do I take decisions off the CEO's plate to free him or her to do what they need to get done? In thinking through those things, that's a gap. You don't see that on job descriptions. And that's what the CEO needs and wants as much as managing the administrative tasks that are on that CHRO.
You raise a really good point too, Kevin. I think oftentimes if you start at the bottom of an organization, individual contributors get elevated into management. They didn't go to school for management. Maybe they went for finance or strategy. And so they have to learn those skills. I found as you continue to move up in an organization, like you said, it gets lonelier, but it's also often hard. I don't come across executives often that are very good at the 30,000 foot level. They're strategic, but they can go down to the 5,000 foot when they need to. They either play on one side or the other. Is that a skill that can be learned? Do you think executives can pick that up where they surround themselves with the people who can do the execution and they can focus on the strategy?
A couple of great questions in there, Adam. Can it be learned? Maybe. I think it's a responsibility of every CHRO to try. One of the other questions you've got to ask yourself as the lead of a function of CAO, CHRO, what is my unique contribution? What is it that I do that no one else can do? If you got a strong head of comp and benefits and you're managing comp and benefits, that's not unique. If you got a strong head of talent management and recruiting and they're doing that and you're managing on top of that, that's not unique. So what is the unique space? And what's the space that the CFO is not filling or the general counsel is not filling? There's other senior people on the team that make unique contributions. You use the word consigliere. As a consigliere to the CEO, what's the unique contribution that you can make? It can be learned. Certainly you can learn from mistakes. I believe I was a little bit risk averse early in my career. And then I began to say, well, what's the worst that can happen? And certainly made mistakes. There's no such thing as a career without mistakes. But, the great definition of a mistake is it's only a mistake if you haven't learned from it.
That's a really great point. Where did you end up going for university? Did you go right after high school?
I cobbled together my higher education. So coming from a modest means, I went to a parochial high school. I got accepted into several very nice colleges. I remember having this conversation with my father. I sat down and I said, Dad, look at these great schools. Look at these beautiful campuses. Can we go up and can we tour them? And he turned to me and said, well, funding is part of this question. And he said to me, how are you going to fund it? And I was playing music at the time. That certainly wasn't funding anything. So long story short, I ended up going to a community college for the first 2 years because the tuition was $600 a semester. And I could afford that working like part-time job at JCPenney selling shoes and playing music.
I worked at Sears selling TVs, and so I can appreciate that.
It was a great lesson. So I did 2 years at the community college in New York. One of those was upstate New York, and wrestled with my career at that time. Is it going to be music? Is it going to be school? Then went to St. John's University in Jamaica, Queens, and took radio, television, and media production. Like many people who choose disciplines, it was shiny and it was fun. I didn't spend a lot of time on the employment question. How would I be employed? Do I really want to be behind a camera? Or what do I have to do to go through that? So I came out of school and found that there were little to no jobs in that field. That my degree really didn't qualify me for that. My father, as I said, was a medic into medicine. So I interviewed for pharmaceutical representatives, but my education did not prepare me for that. And I ended up getting a job instead in consumer goods, selling cookies for Keebler. I'll go back to that in a minute, but it was later that I went to get my graduate degree in personnel psychology from NYU, and PepsiCo sponsored me for that.
My mentor went to NYU for his PhD. This is the 60s, where he was one of the first to get it from there. So very familiar, great school, great program.
Great program. At that time, I was living on Long Island in New York, commuting up to Purchase up Westchester, New York. People may not know these geographies, but long distance up to work in PepsiCo. Back down to New York City at night to go to night school for NYU, and then back out to Long Island. So I was putting in, I don't know what they were, 18-hour days working professionally and trying to get my degree. But so thankful that I had at that time worked for a company that sponsored graduate degree.
So I want to go back. Was JCPenney's one of your first jobs after the band when you were in community college?
Yeah, that was probably one of my first, quote, professional jobs as a younger individual. I did it all. I worked on a landscaping crew and I worked on a painting crew, painting penthouses in New York. And I did the work that I needed to do to get myself through the community college. Different jobs, different fields. A great question, Adam, because in all of those jobs, I learned what I don't want to do.
Okay, that's a great point. I look at my time. I was working part-time at Sears when I was a junior in high school, and I started in the paint department. making 0.002 commission on a can of paint. And a year later, I got promoted into the hardware department. Now I'm making 2%. Then I got promoted into plumbing. I ended up spending all my undergrad there part-time and ended up going into the TV department where it was all commission. And I will tell clients, I learned more about human nature and relationships and sabotage and backstabbing from that job, from any other job after that. Were there some early lessons that you learned from any of the jobs that you took with you throughout your career?
Yeah, I learned, and you got to put in a certain amount of time. You got to put in a certain amount of effort. You have to show up with the discipline and integrity. You have to understand the business that you're in and contribute to the bottom line. And so once I learned those lessons, I thought, what's the best way to apply? I've got a finite amount of energy. I've got a finite amount of capabilities. Where can I apply that for the maximum return? And I knew it wasn't going to be, one of these more difficult manual labor jobs. I learned that very early.
So was Pepsi your first major corporate job when you were going back and getting your graduate degree?
Let me give you the timeline. My first real job was Keebler Cookies. I was a territory salesman. I remember interviewing. I got a great offer, great at the time, $12,000 a year on a company car.
There you go.
The car was the Pinto.
Okay.
A lot of people wouldn't know that car, but it was known for being terrible in car accidents, exploding and hurting people. But I was very proud of myself. A company car, an expense account, and I got a commission. Selling cookies, not even grocery stores, they were bodegas and mom and pop shops was my territory. But I did well. Out of 70 salespeople in the US at that time, I was amongst the top 3 sales producers.
What do you attribute that to? What was the reason for that?
I've got to go back to interpersonal skills. It wasn't about what I was selling. It was about how I could solve problems for the grocers that I worked with. These were hardworking people that were going to make 2 cents on a bag of cookies. And so learning their business and learning how to do that was critically important. I did it for just about a year before they promoted me to district manager. And as a district manager, I got to manage the sales team. I was nominated as district manager of the year. And then they brought me into what they called a zone position where they made me responsible for hiring, training, and recruiting the sales force for Keebler everywhere from Washington, D.C. through Maine was my territory. And I would travel and I would recruit and assess and train people. And that's where I began to realize how to assemble teams. Actually, as a district manager, I recognized that my fortune was tied to people who work for me, and I'd only be as good as the weakest link on my team.
That's really great. When was the first time you realized people were looking to you for leadership? Was it that district manager role, or was there a role beyond that where you realized I have a lot of impact on these people?
Yeah, it was the district manager role. But even as a salesperson, I showed up and those above me would call on me to fill in for people who weren't showing up for work.
Yeah.
You got to go up to the Bronx because somebody didn't show up for work. You got to go deep in Manhattan because somebody didn't show up for work. So I had to go to different places and different territories and fill in. And so I learned about the exposure and the pain of people not doing their jobs and what that meant to an organization. And I fill in for them because I was a more predictable producer.
I found that early on my consulting career when I was with RHR International, I had a very unique perspective where I got into the medical device industry working with district managers and regional managers. And then I also got into the electronics industry with Best Buy and got to see store managers, district managers, regional managers. So 2 different industries, but exactly to your point, hard work ethic, the ability to put in time, raise your hand, volunteer for things. Those were the folks who really stood out, who would fill in for other people, who would go above and beyond what they needed to do. And so I think it's a real good testament to probably some of the successes you had of doing that. So PepsiCo, what was that like? I did some consulting work with them early on, Pepsi Bottling Company, great culture. They had some great IO psychologists that came from NYU and Columbia, some other universities. What was that part of your career like?
That was an education on steroids. At one point in time, I can recall out of the Fortune 500 companies, 50 of their top HR leaders were ex-PepsiCo.
Wow.
PepsiCo and GE were exporting HR leaders. It was very interesting because I worked with a crowd of young men and women, a very diverse crowd. So many of them had a much more formal education, went to Cornell, labor relations, and Pepsi had an organization, a psychologist, one of the smartest people I've ever worked for, Robert Eichinger. He wrote the book FYI, and I worked with him for a number of years. PepsiCo had John Scully there at that time running the organization before he went to run Apple. Roger Enrico was president of Pepsi at 35 years old. It
Wow.
was extraordinary. It was high energy. It was exciting. It was great branding with Madonna and Michael Jackson and the Pepsi generation. So it was a group of the highest performing, most dedicated, smartest people. I ran a group which was called the Pepsi Management Institute. It was effectively a consulting group, a training group, a human resource support group for the independent bottlers. When I got there, 80% of the bottlers were independently owned. So my team would call on the New York City bottler or the Chicago bottler or the San Francisco bottler, and they were independent. And so they didn't necessarily have full corporate build outs. They didn't necessarily have professional marketing organizations or professional HR organizations or fleet management. People don't know soft drinks are the second largest fleet in the nation next to the post office. So there's aspects to this business about accounting, management, fleet management, marketing, distribution, manufacturing. And the group that I had would work with these people. They were wildly successful. I remember one time going to one of the bottlers who commuted into work in Colorado on their own helicopter, and they owned the television station and two of the car dealerships. So they were very successful, smart people. And my consulting group had to provide them with advice, instruction, training, tools, skills in terms of how to make their business better. An amazing education, Adam, working at a very young age with all of these outstanding entrepreneurs and CEOs of these bottling companies.
Any mistakes you made early on at that point that were lessons learned you took with you later on?
Yeah, I don't know if they were mistakes or lack of confidence, but the tasks were so big and the job was so tough, and sitting in front of people who were so successful was so challenging that there was an element of fear and challenge in that job. I would have to go and talk to a bottler who was worth tens of millions of dollars, if not more, and help instruct them in terms of how to run their business. So I had to do my homework, had to assemble the right consulting team around me, because in most cases we were charging these people. Some of the services were free, but some of them were services for fee, and had to be sure that there was good value.
Was that challenging for you being younger in your career? Maybe some of these bottling groups were 20, 30 years older than you at certain times. I look at my early career. I started consulting at RHR when I was 26. I don't know if you're familiar with their firm, but they primarily work with board CEOs, senior executives. They told me during the interview process, we don't hire folks like you because you have no experience. We're going to make an exception and hire you for your potential. But I was in rooms with Ben Maché from AIG. I was in rooms with the founder of Keurig Green Mountain. And so I won't call it fear, but definitely that intimidation that if you're going to speak with a CEO, there's a certain way you got to carry yourself, a certain way you have to dress. But was it intimidating for you to be younger early in your career and you're leading a consulting group and you're advising these people who may have been running their business for 20, 25 years?
Yeah. So I understand your example and had the same experience, Adam. And I do know RHR and the board practices and have worked with them and understand that consulting model. So I can relate to that. Just to be frank, I've always wanted to be in a job that I could grow into as opposed to a job where I know everything and I'm fully fit. I want some upside. I want some learning. And so in my career, I would attempt to overreach. I would attempt to go into jobs that were going to challenge me, go into jobs where I could learn as much as I could give. But look, anyone who's self-aware recognizes when you're in a job like that you don't know everything.
That's right.
That you may give a bad piece of advice. Books have been written about this, whether you call it the fraud syndrome or self-doubt.
Yep.
And so part of learning and being a great leader is learning to work in a space where you don't have all the answers. And then you have to get the answers. And part of getting the answers is not reciting verbatim answers to all these challenges on the spot, but saying, let's examine that problem. Let's look at that problem. It's what great consulting groups do and what leaders do. Let's think about how we solve this problem. So that's part of it, is the approach. Another part of it is I was able to staff my group with the absolute leading experts in their field. I had a consultant who had managed the fleet for the U.S. Post Office and for many of these other UPS and large organizations. I had a consultant in economics from the University of Chicago and finance. I had one of the greatest consultants on communication skills for leadership, and on and on. And so knowing the answer is part of the challenge, finding the answer is part of the challenge, but bringing the resources to the problem is part of it. It's a great question, Adam, because so many times people think they need to be the singular source of all the wisdom and energy. And that's not the case. That's your earlier point, ego talking. I think a leader needs to facilitate the solutions, facilitate the answers, bring the right people to the problem, bring the resources to the problem. That's much more valuable than attempting to be a singular star or an expert across the field.
Yeah, absolutely. How long did you spend at Pepsi before the next role?
I spent a decade at Pepsi. It was great. I traveled every state in the union. I was interested to go to Billings, Montana, or River, Washington, or San Francisco. In my 20s, I was traveling. It's at a different time. It's at a time where corporations had more freer expense accounts. So the travel was not painful. It was good. And it was amazingly educational, just amazingly educational. And 10 years of solid work, working with some of the best minds and colleagues that I could.
Where did you go after that?
I believe next was MasterCard.
Okay. Another great organization.
Yeah, another wonderful organization. I joined MasterCard early with the hope of becoming the CHRO, and very shortly there I was the CHRO.
What do you attribute that to? If I could pause you there, just in terms of coming in, and you have a lot of folks who will step into roles that they're either promised or on the succession pipeline. There's stuff that you have to do. There's a bit of chance and a bit of luck that's there. But what do you attribute you ascending to that role so quickly?
Well, let me explain what was happening at the time, and that'll help the situation. I love PepsiCo. I could have stayed there forever. Over time, the bottlers, the independent franchise bottlers, were all being bought out by the company itself. It was becoming the Pepsi Bottling Group. And the job I would have had, a district employee relations manager running a quarter of the country as a CHRO, maybe out of Detroit or something, was less interesting to me. And so I wanted to move into a more traditional HR role. I went and talked to one of the leading recruiting firms in New York at that time who had CHRO jobs and really got knocked down a peg. This person looked at my resume, looked me square in the eye and said, whatever makes you think you could be qualified to be a chief HR officer.
Wow.
Your resume doesn't say it. I think you're barking up the wrong tree. Greatly humiliating experience because this was a highly credentialed search person who had the gloves off in giving me this. So great learning experience. I had to either let them define me and take stock of that. This is an expert in this field. They know what HR people are and their qualifications. Either they will define me based on my experience or I'll define myself. I decided to define myself and took the MasterCard job under that premise. I'll come in the wings. I'll come in under the chief HR officer. The chief HR officer at that time went in to run a business, and then I was able to run that job. Just an amazing opportunity and a great experience, and the largest financial settlement, one of the largest financial settlement institutions in the world, global finance, exciting. IT was a huge part of that. And so the opportunity was big, the learning was big, and the job was very rewarding.
Biggest success, biggest setback in that role?
Biggest success was assembling a brilliant team. I'm still in contact with them, friends, colleagues. Biggest success was doing the job. I'm still friends with the individual who was CEO and chairman decades after I left there. Maybe biggest disappointment is it didn't last longer. I left at the time that the CEO left, and another opportunity had come up right at that time. So I jumped on that next opportunity.
And that next opportunity was what?
The next opportunity was Merrill Lynch. That was the big time. It was to be the chief HR officer for Merrill Lynch for effectively all the businesses except for what you'd call private client or private wealth or stockbroker. So the rest of the organization, banking, debt, equity, government relations. The money was big. Wall Street was big. I won't say it was like the movie
Wall Street. I joke with a lot of folks. There are a lot of stereotypes in it, but there is a lot of truth.
I will tell you, Adam, as I watched The Wolf of Wall Street, I was able to sit with my wife and say, well, that's my office. Winter Garden. Here's where I went to lunch. This is where I worked. It was a very heady time, and there were brilliant minds there at the same time.
What were you most proud of in that role? Was this a point where you realized I was born to do this? There was that sense of confidence that you knew what was going on?
I realized that all my skills were employable. I guess if you call the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, I guess I'm proud of running with the wolves. These people were some of the smartest, most aggressive, politically savvy, high interpersonal skills, focused individuals collected in one spot. ever. And working with them was quite a challenge.
What did you attribute your ability to adapt and adjust? So I started doing a lot of work early in my career around private equity. And so they're also the types of folks who are from a certain cloth, starting where you did with Pepsi and then MasterCard and then going into Wall Street. Were there challenges early on that you had to navigate to figure out how to run with the wolves?
What did I attribute it to? Tenacity, commitment, hunger to learn, desire to add value, and my love of people. And these were different people. But talk about spider senses. I woke up every day tingly with my spider senses on fire. What's today going to bring? It was unpredictable. It was a crisis environment. It was a business with a lot of variability on any given day. And so it drew out of me a whole new set of skills.
What was the biggest success you had while you were there? What are you most proud of?
I hate to use the word surviving, but surviving. Why do I say that? I was there for 3 or 4 years. The 6 people who preceded me in that role, I was told later, each lasted 1 year approximately. And so the challenge and the demand of the job, the hours, the stress, there were some things I didn't like about the business though. I don't want to disparage the business, but it was a lot about compensation and how people were paid. Top producers were paid very well. Middle producers were paid with what was left, and lower producers were out the door. The first year that I ran that compensation and reward system, I said, wow, this is tough luck on these people at the bottom. And the second year I ran that, I said, wow, coincidence, 2 years in a row. And the third year I said, okay, this is how we do business. And so there's great learning in that. And of course, that sets a different culture. I'm not judging the culture, but it's not a soft culture. It's a hard culture, and it's about productivity and financial results.
So I'm glad you went there. I think that was the area I wanted to go to around culture. As CHRO or Chief People Officer, you are the ambassador. You are the person that, in partnership with the CEO and other C-suite executives, shape the culture, mold the culture. Was there different places outside of that where the culture ambassador, culture carrier became part of your role as a CHRO?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things that a CHRO can do is understand, monitor, build, shape, evaluate, create culture with the CEO. I think every company has a culture. They may not understand that. And there's 2 ways that a company can have culture. One is by design. We want this culture. Without design, a company will have a culture by default. They don't realize it, but it's by default. Now, every company generally has inscribed on the walls or in their annual report, here's who we are. Here's our values. Here's our behaviors, or here's our culture. We attest to that. But then you got to ask, how do employees experience culture? And they don't experience culture by reading the Declaration of Values and Purpose. They experience culture by understanding leadership behaviors. Culture is experienced as the sum of leadership behaviors in my life as an employee. The sum of these leadership behaviors impact who I am. That's culture. Now, most cultures, as written, are quite aspirational. So when the aspirational culture is demonstrated by the leadership behaviors and they're in alignment, you have a company that's in harmony. You have a culture that's in harmony. When these are the attestations of culture from a company, but the leadership behaviors are different, you have a company in chaos. You have people saying no integrity, chaos, not true. And a great part of the CHRO's role to figure that out.
That's a great point. I did a lot of work when I was with AIG. This is after the bailout. Top 30 leaders in the company under Ben Mache were assessed by our HR. They went through the whole process, 360s. And then they wanted to reshape a leadership competency model that would start at the top and cascade down. Any experiences you've had in building those leadership models and the lessons learned from being the architect of those things?
Yeah, I think it's good to have leadership models. I think it's good to have values. I think it's good to have declaration of purpose. Many companies think the establishment of those is the exercise.
Yeah. That's part one.
No, that's the introduction of the book. So I've seen many companies put that together, tack it up on the wall, and walk away. There's a whole series of exercises to get to the right culture after that. You've got to go back and say to the CEO and the management team, is this, and even the board, is this who we want to be? Is this what we can be? And there's a whole bunch of things. There's leadership behaviors. Many times cultures are a bit of a boondoggle. They forget to put a commercial element in that. Now, these companies exist
to make money.
to make money. They're a commercial enterprise. It's not the Boy Scouts and it's not a religious organization. And yet many companies' cultures are written as if it was a not-for-profit organization. So being a commercial enterprise means you're going to do difficult things.
Yeah.
You're going to carry an expense load. And you're going to be able to feed and care for a certain amount of people, but not everybody. And it means the business may go up and the business may go down. And that's going to have an impact on the people in the organization. And financially healthy organizations act one way, and financially distressed organizations act another way. So culture is a big part of that. Now that we've made these leadership behaviors and culture, are we going to evaluate our senior team? Does everybody on the team meet this? And if they don't meet it, can they get there? And if they don't meet it, do we want to invest in them getting there or not? Not everybody can get there. People aren't built that way. That doesn't agree with their own personal system. There's a big evaluative process. And then there's an element of reward. And reward's got two sides to it. It's reward and consequence. Are we going to reward the people who get there and support it? And those who don't, will they suffer a negative consequence?
Leadership accountability.
Leadership accountability. So be careful of initiating this exercise because it has consequences.
I did a fascinating engagement about a year or so ago with an investment management firm, part of a bigger insurance company. New CEO in the role. I had coached him a couple of years prior to help prepare him. Coming into the role, there was some turmoil, some changes in the C-suite, but there were no shared values. There were no leadership principles. And as you went C-1, C-2 into the organization, there started to be themes that emerged: poor cross-functional collaboration, lack of leadership accountability, speed in decision-making. So these were all things that, to your point, because they weren't modeled at the top, I think that's a big piece of, once you get the framework in place, are your senior leaders assessed against that framework? And then are they modeling those behaviors with their teams and on down? We found that being one of the key things that was impacting their culture, is that the playbook hadn't been set. And then there weren't behaviors that were being modeled consistently across that team.
Absolutely.
As you think about the next generation of C-suite leaders, there's a lot that you've learned at your point. I know you're retired now, but there's probably a legacy you left with a lot of people at Voya and some of the other organizations you were at. What 3 or 4 piece of advice would you have for folks on the succession pipeline? They're going to be in a C-suite role, maybe not the next role, but the role after that. What do they need to know as they get into these roles?
Great question, Adam. Number one piece of advice: understand how you add value and be sure that you add unique value. 2, invest in key relationships. Many times we get distracted by doing the work and feeding the work and not feeding the relationships. Critically important. Who are the key relationships? How do you work with those people? How do you support those people? What do they say about you when you're not in the room? How do they value you? What's your role in supporting them?
Can I pause you there? Because I have a concern with that, looking at the next generation, millennials, Gen Zs. You look at the role that AI is going to continue to play over the next 3-4 years. The importance of relationships will be even more incrementally critical. But I feel like the opportunities for that take place. You look at remote hybrid work now since COVID, there seems to be less and less opportunities for people to have that. And you can't get to a place of trust or being a consigliere if you're not even in the office half the time, or things are not taking place face to face. So does that concern you for future generations, that the emphasis on relationships may not be placed where it needs to be?
I think it's a great question, Adam. Emphasis may not be placed on relationships. The opportunity may not be there because of the way the work is designed in a remote environment. I think one needs to therefore work twice as hard to create the relationship. Doing work in the absence of relationships is unsustainable. The work itself is not nourishing. It's vanilla. It can be invisible, and it doesn't always have a personality behind it. Relationships, a trust, desire to work together, people valuing each other.
Yeah.
That's critically important. As you mentioned, it may not happen naturally, and therefore one needs to make that happen. It might be a social event, might be dinner, might be going to lunch. There are times in my career where in one circumstance, I would have lunch with the CEO almost every day in their office. Another time, different company, different CEO that was more of a corporate campus. After lunch, CEO and I would go for a walk on the corporate campus. Now, mind you, half of it is about a business, but a quarter of it is we're dealing with people who are trying to solve life problems also. They're not just trying to solve corporate problem. They're also trying to solve, how do I get to my job? What are the personal challenges that are pulling me away from my job? And how do I work on that? So people are whole human beings, and relationships are important in supporting one another.
Yeah, that's a great point. Leadership, it's something that I've been passionate about now for over 20 years. Give me your leadership playbook. What are the skills that every leader needs from your experiences? What makes her a good, strong leader?
The best leaders attract and draw people to them. The people will gravitate to and follow leaders who aren't necessarily even formal leaders. So that gets back to relationship and interest in people. Authority over people is probably the weakest tie for a leader. Being able to draw people in because you have their interest, because you're on a common mission. Those are the greatest aspects of leadership. And the person who can do that eventually will rise to the top. And when they rise to the top, will be most successful in keeping that leadership position.
Where would you recommend people look for role models or mentors? If you look at a macroeconomic landscape, you look at countries across the globe, authoritative leadership is emerging very strongly. There are not politicians or people that folks can look up to. Any advice in terms of who you think they should be looking for this influence, that authority, being more of a servant leader?
I don't think it's a position. I don't think it's a geography to look towards. I do think it's confusing right now in the world where there is leadership. I think one of the guiding principles that people should look at is, who do I admire? Who do I want to be led by? Who inspires me? Has high integrity, high vision, a strong purpose, who attracts people to them, who's doing meaningful work, who has a meaningful purpose in life. That's where one needs to look for a leader model or a mentor model. Also, I think sometimes people think that there needs to be a mentor. It may be several mentors or several leaders. And so I think one needs to assemble that. This person is good for leading me in terms of my personal life, spirituality, how I give back to others. This person's a good leader in terms of my commercial and corporate leadership, and puts that together. So I think looking in several places is important as well.
Legacy is another important piece. What did you learn about legacy, the impact you leave on others? What was that journey like for you as you went through that stage?
I think legacy is important, but I'm not sure that you build it consciously. I think you leave behind the example of who you are, the example of what you've accomplished, the example of how you've helped others. People will experience that in different ways. There's not a universal experience. People have different value sets. They have different aspirations. And so you may have helped them in their career, or you may have been in the way of their aspiration. But I think one needs to have high integrity. I think one needs to serve others ahead of themselves. And I think one needs to produce unselfish outcomes. What's in the best interest of the company? What's in the best interest of the group I'm serving? I think if one, as a leader, has that focus, the legacy naturally falls into place.
Yeah, that's a great point. Given your experiences, Kevin, what advice do you wish every first-time C-suite leader needs to hear?
I think every first-time leader needs to learn. I think they need to surround themselves with good mentors. What you put in your ears is important. I learned a lesson that I'd share middle of my career, not early in my career. I read my New Year's resolutions every year.
I do as well.
And sometimes they're career-based, and sometimes they're things like eat better and exercise. They're personal health items. Sometimes they're relationships. Sometimes they're family.
You write them down, right?
I write them down. I kind of put them away, look at them a couple of times during the year. But as ambitious people, and the models you're talking about are people with ambition who want to lead and do things, those people are typically hard on themselves. The loudest voice in all of our lives is the small inner voice. It's the hardest voice. It's the most evaluative voice. It can be a deafening voice. It can be a negative voice, especially for people with high ambitions who are striving. So I've had to learn how to accept defeat, how to accept not getting one's way, how to accept disappointment in life. But one of the New Year's resolutions I wrote, Adam, one year was, be kind to Kevin.
Yeah, that's a great lesson.
Be kind to Kevin. As someone who strives to do a lot, I pushed. I'm always pushing myself to be my best. I wasn't necessarily kind to myself in all of that. And putting that as a definitive resolution helped shape my thinking, helped me understand, call it mistakes or disappointments or things that didn't turn my way, much better. So I think an element of self-understanding, an element of self-nurturing, an element of self-kindness needs to be there if we're going to run with our foot down on the pedal all the time.
Right. Yeah. At what point in your career did that resolution come into place? Was it later career, mid-career? When did you say, be kind to Kevin?
It was a later career. I wish it came in earlier. It might have reduced some of the pain or confusion, but it came in later. And when it came, I had an aha moment.
If you could go back to 30-year-old Kevin, the one who was at Pepsi, what advice would you give him now knowing what you've been through?
I'd add that element in because I think 30-year-old Kevin had the rest of aspiration, overreach, try hard, be good to people, unlock the full potential of others, be high integrity. I think those lessons I learned earlier in my life, whether you call it balance or self-kindness, is something. Now, there's another element of that also, which came earlier in my career, is the greatest success comes from helping others, not helping oneself. And I learned that pretty early, but it continued to magnify in my career. And the more I helped others, surprisingly, the more I enjoyed success. Early in my career, I defined success very differently. I'm ashamed to say one of my first measures of success was a BMW 3 Series.
I think that's for most people, it's getting financially stable or secure.
I'm earlier in my career. I was at PepsiCo. There were a lot of BMW 3 Series. I got one.
Better than the Pinto?
It was better than the Pinto. I had it in my driveway. I said, look at that. And a week later, I said, is that it? Is that all there is? And I recognized my father, you talk about mentors, had a great definition of success. So many times in our society, we want to measure success by personal gain, by personal recognition. It's my title, it's my compensation, it's my house, it's my car, it's my personal possessions. That's incredibly shallow, and inevitably it's unsatisfying. But my father's definition of success, he said, as you go through your careers, you can define your success in terms of the positive impact you have on the lives of others. I'm not talking about a religious experience here, but I am talking about helping others advance in their career, helping others achieve the purpose of the company, helping others unlock their full potential. That's the greatest measure of success. So when I look back and I see the CHROs that I've helped and put into jobs and the executives and others I've helped, that's good. Now, sometimes the help, though, Adam, is not pleasant. I've also had to tell a few people that they were in the wrong role, that they weren't succeeding in their role. Sometimes helping others is less than a joyful experience. It's a truthful experience. I did have to help somebody very early in my career when I was still in my 20s, help them figure out that they were in the wrong job. They went to another job, helped them get to the other job, and were wildly successful. They wrote back to me, you saved me. I was on the wrong path. You pointed me in a different direction. I am having a great career. So having the courage to do that is also quite important.
Yeah, given the work that I do as an external consultant, I think that's the most gratifying. Well, first, one of my early mentors said to me, you do good work, you get more work. And that's been my philosophy when it comes to consulting, is if you come in, really our work together at Voya was a great example. I came in to coach a C-suite leader who ended up leaving the company a year or so later. And oftentimes the executive goes, the coach goes, but you and I built a relationship. One of your direct reports and I built a relationship, and we ended up building a whole succession management, succession planning program with you guys. And so I'm very proud that a third of that C-suite today are folks that I directly coach and help to accelerate their growth into that. So that's always the most fulfilling to me, is to work with leaders for a couple of years. They have aspirations to be somewhere, whether it's in the C-suite or doing a larger role than they're doing today, and to really be able to get into their leadership, understand them, maybe even better than they understand themselves, and bring that out so they can be the best versions. And so that's something that I think is important. But I've also had to work with some leaders and say, just like you said, hey, this is not the right role for you, or this is not the right culture. You're either getting taken advantage of, or your skills could be used elsewhere. And those are tough conversations. I've had many tough 360 conversations where you have to tell someone the way you think you come across is not how others perceive you. And I found that the two biggest things that I would say senior leaders don't get preparation for is the self-awareness component. How do I know what I'm showing up like when I walk into a room? Then the second part is, how do I read a room? How do I know the stakeholders that I'm with? That always changes. So those things are important there. Before we get to some rapid fire questions, Kevin, podcast will go out to a wide audience, leaders across industries. What do you hope people walk away with from our conversation today?
I hope people walk away inspired to do more, inspired to find out how they add value in their organization, inspired to focus very heavily on unleashing the talent in others. And I hope if they get those things out, they'll realize the boost that gives to their own career.
Yeah, well said. So I have a couple rapid fire ones. Let me start. What's one word your previous team would use to describe your leadership style?
Caring.
What's one misconception people often have about you?
Underestimate me because I'm quiet. I don't turn tables over. And so people will underestimate that on occasion as lack of conviction or lack of strength.
Do you think that's a spidey sense secret skill the C-suite leader should have? The one who's quiet and who observes versus the one who has to be the first to speak?
I do think that's a skill. And I do think it's a learned skill. I've seen the leadership style where leaders lead with emotion, loudness, great animation, and lack of thinking, because that feels natural. I don't think that's a successful model. I've seen those who take in feedback, who observe, who contemplate,
Yep.
and react measured and firmly are the ones who lead much better.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it earlier. What were the three things that differentiate great senior executives? Wisdom. What were the other two?
It was wisdom, judgment, and character. And people inevitably will look to see, does this ultimate leader have wisdom, judgment, and character, which is
Yeah.
different than do they have all the answers to every technical problem.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. What's one thing at this stage in your life that you geek out on?
That I geek out on.
You can say shoes. I know we share our shoe passion. Remember that a couple of years ago, you showed me the shoes you got online, and they were ones that I had in my basement.
Yeah, look, people may not know. I like fashion and I like music and I like travel. I like motorcycles and fast cars or well-engineered cars. And so I guess those are geeky things. I'm spending most of my time, though, right now, Adam, on relationships. I got a list of people and a list of things that I want to do. I'm doing some counseling, coaching,
That's great.
if you will. And that's given me great satisfaction.
That's wonderful. First word that comes to mind when you think of social media.
Whipped cream.
Why do you say that?
I think you get tubs of it and just end up never being full and only feeling sick.
Yeah, that's a great enough. First thing that comes to mind when you hear AI.
Beware.
Do you think it's going to have sweeping effects across industries? There's a lot you're seeing, obviously, in the last year or so in the news. I've been doing some research with some colleagues of mine. I think one of the things that is not going to go away is that human to human in-person contact. I think you'll see a lot of conferences, whenever the people can be in the room together and not have AI present, I think is going to be really important. And that's going to become less and less. For folks like me, that's good because training, being in person is going to be critical. But does that concern you for the next generations that the opportunities that you had are not going to be afforded to younger folks?
What concerns me is people giving up their critical thinking, their ability to problem solve on their own. I think AI is going to do so many amazing things for us in medicine and research and fact finding. It's going to accelerate us as a human race. I don't think AI is going to substitute wisdom, judgment, and character.
That's right.
So I don't think it can fill those spaces. And therefore, I don't think AI can lead. And people who will look for AI to lead are going to be afraid. I don't think we fully understand the unintended consequences of AI. What if and when AI goes in a direction that it wants to go, which is just not unheard of. We've read in the news where people are getting psychological counseling from AI and it doesn't always produce the right effect. So one's ability to maintain their own critical thinking in a world filled with AI will be very important.
Last question today, Kevin. What's a word of wisdom mantra that you've lived your life by that's made you successful, both personally and professionally across your life?
I think integrity and caring are two things. Integrity means trying to do the right thing. Doesn't mean you always will do the right thing. Doesn't mean you won't make a mistake. Integrity should not be misunderstood as perfection. The human condition makes us imperfect. But striving to have integrity and to be sure people have genuine experiences with you is critically important.
One of the things I admire about you the most, I don't know if you remember this moment, but our first sit down when we had a 4-way alignment meeting with Rod and the leader I was working with, you took it upon yourself to walk me out of the building that day and just spend a couple of minutes with me talking about debriefing the meeting, something that you didn't have to do. And that caring was something I experienced firsthand, which again, I'm just an external consultant, not a part of the organization, but that time that you took meant a lot to me and our relationship that has evolved from that.
It's great. Thank you, Adam.
Well, thanks, Kevin. This is wonderful. I really appreciate, I think there's a lot that the next generation can learn from leaders like you who put a focus on the wisdom, judgment, and the character. So I really appreciate your time today. And thank you so much.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed this time with you, Adam. Thanks.
One of the ways you can support this channel is to subscribe, like, and comment on the video. This tremendously helps with the YouTube algorithms to get the Tales from the C-Suite podcast, broader exposure to leaders from all walks of life. I would greatly appreciate your help in supporting the growth of our channel. If you find our interviews insightful and helpful with your career, please encourage your friends and colleagues to also listen to our episodes and subscribe, like, and comment on the videos.